What if everything you think you know about ancient empires is hiding a truth far darker than any battlefield legend? Before swords clashed and cities fell, there was another war being fought in silence, one that targeted women in ways so brutal that even seasoned soldiers struggled to comprehend what they witnessed. And here is the question that echoes through the ruins of history. How much violence against women did ancient empires intentionally erase from their own records? And why were these stories buried so deeply that only fragments remained? This question is not only provocative, it is the key to understanding the real machinery of domination that shaped ancient power. When we look at the victories carved in stone, the triumphant inscriptions, the glorified emperors, we see only what the empire wanted posterity to admire. But behind every conquest, there were women captured, stripped of identity, turned into spoils of war, and used as living symbols of submission. These were not isolated acts of cruelty. They were systematic strategies woven into the fabric of expansion, designed to break entire communities by targeting their mothers, their daughters, and their future generations. And yet, much of this violence was intentionally hidden, softened, or rewritten by chroniclers who served the interests of kings and generals. Imagine an army marching through a conquered city. Loot and territory mattered, but the real message of domination was delivered through the bodies of the women who lived there. Some soldiers followed orders they did not dare disobey. Others participated willingly, encouraged by commanders who believed that fear and humiliation were stronger tools than any weapon. The psychological warfare inflicted on women was not collateral damage. It was policy, a calculated choice that shaped the reputation of empires from Mesopotamia to Rome. And today, as we look back at the remains of these civilizations, we must ask ourselves, why did they need to hide these truths? Who benefited from the silence? And how many stories of courage, suffering, and resistance were lost because history chose to protect the victors rather than the victims? You might even recognize traces of these patterns in other periods of history, and perhaps you have come across moments when the official narrative simply did not make sense. Have you ever felt that history was filtering what you were allowed to know? If this resonates with you, leave a comment, sharing your impression, because your voice helps uncover what was suppressed for centuries. And if this topic speaks to you, make sure to like this video and check whether you are already subscribed to the channel, because what you will discover next may challenge even more of what you thought you understood. As we move forward, the veil begins to lift, revealing layers of cruelty and hidden truth that connect directly to the next chapter of this story, drawing us deeper into what the ancient empires desperately tried to conceal. As the curtain lifts on what empires tried to conceal, the next layer reveals something even more disturbing. The brutality directed at captured women was not an uncontrolled explosion of violence, nor the spontaneous cruelty of individual soldiers. It was a political tool, crafted with precision, used to fracture conquered societies from the inside. When an empire seized new territory, it did not stop at taking land or wealth. It sought absolute dominion over the conquered people's sense of dignity, identity, and continuity. Women stood at the center of this strategy, targeted because harming them inflicted wounds that spread through entire communities like invisible fire. Ancient generals understood something chilling. If you break the women, you break the cultural backbone of a nation. Women carried traditions, shaped the next generation, and symbolized the honor of their households. Empires knew this and weaponized it. In many campaigns, the capture of women was planned with the same cold calculation as the deployment of infantry units. They were cataloged, separated, redistributed, or paraded, depending on the political message leaders wanted to send. To some commanders, parading captured women before a conquered population was a demonstration that resistance was useless. To others, they were bargaining pieces, assigned to officers as rewards, or sent to distant regions to erase any trace of their original identity. Inside military camps, The treatment of captured women varied, but the underlying goal was always the same. Broken women meant broken communities. Fear traveled faster than any messenger, and soon entire regions surrendered without a fight, terrified of suffering the same fate. Soldiers were often ordered to enforce this terror, turning brutality into a form of communication. These acts created psychological shockwaves that lasted generations, reshaping the traditions, family structures, and even the collective memory of entire peoples. It is here that we see how deep this strategy ran. Some empires built their power not only on armies and roads, but on the calculated destruction of the social fabric of conquered territories. The mistreatment of captured women became a silent language of empire, one rarely preserved in official records, but whispered through archaeological evidence, regional folklore, and the few independent accounts that survived censorship. And if you follow these traces closely, you begin to see the empire's true architecture, a structure held together not only by military strength, but by the deliberate manipulation of human suffering. What makes this even more unsettling is how normalized these acts became within imperial ideology. Chroniclers who might have condemned such brutality either softened their descriptions or avoided them entirely. The violence became a shadow people were forced to live with, but forbidden to name. And this silence, repeated across centuries, shaped the distorted version of antiquity that many still imagine today. As we continue peeling back these layers, the next chapters reveal how this humiliation evolved from political strategy into an emblem of power, transforming women into symbols that empires used to project control far beyond the front lines. As the empire's reach expanded, humiliation became one of its sharpest weapons, turning the suffering of captured women into a public display of domination. This was no longer only a tactic used in the shadows of military camps. It evolved into a symbolic ritual, a spectacle crafted to demonstrate absolute authority. In many ancient societies, the public treatment of women taken in war carried a message more powerful than any decree or victory inscription. By exposing them in acts meant to degrade and intimidate, rulers announced to both enemies and allies that they controlled not only the land, but the very dignity of the people who once lived there. This humiliation took many forms, each designed to break the psychological strength of a conquered community. Women were sometimes forced to walk through ruined streets, stripped of their garments, surrounded by jeering crowds who understood that resistance had become meaningless. At other times, commanders staged elaborate demonstrations in which captured women were displayed alongside trophies of war, turning their suffering into an unspoken proclamation that the empire's authority was unchallenged. These scenes, witnessed by thousands, created imprints in the collective memory that lasted for generations. The trauma did not stay with the individuals alone. It seeped into cultural identity, shaping how entire populations understood defeat. And yet, what makes these acts even more chilling is how normalized they became. Among soldiers, the humiliation of women was not always viewed as an atrocity, but as part of the expected rhythm of conquest. Young recruits were taught that these displays served a purpose, reinforcing discipline and the glory of the empire. Some participated reluctantly, unable to voice dissent without risking punishment. Others absorbed the ideology so deeply that the lines between duty and cruelty blurred. The result was a system in which humiliation became routine, repeated across campaigns as naturally as the raising of banners or the distribution of rations. In the official narratives, however, these acts rarely appeared in detail. Chroniclers mention captives, victory parades, spoils of war, but they often leave out the most devastating elements. The silence is not accidental. Emperors wanted to be remembered as powerful but honorable, victorious but just. To reveal the full extent of what their armies inflicted would tarnish the image they worked tirelessly to construct. So the humiliation of women, though central to imperial power, was pushed into the margins of historical memory, surviving only in scattered accounts. and the echoes of folklore passed down through generations who never forgot what they witnessed. Still, if you look closely enough, the truth emerges between the lines. Artifacts depicting scenes of conquest, carvings showing processions of captives, and private letters exchanged between soldiers all reveal fragments of the reality empires attempted to hide. From these pieces, a clearer picture forms. Women were not merely additional plunder. They were transformed into tools for spectacle, embodiments of defeat meant to amplify the empire's legend and intimidate any who might consider rebellion. And as this practice spread through different regions, a new pattern emerged, one in which humiliation became a symbolic currency that empires traded to maintain their influence, paving the way for even more sinister forms of silence and erasure that shaped the world that followed. As the silence deepens in the official records, it becomes clear that what empires chose not to write reveals more about their true nature than the victories they proudly carved into stone. Chroniclers were not neutral observers. They were instruments of power, tasked with building a sanitized memory of the empire. The treatment of captured women, especially the most extreme forms of violence, became one of the first things to vanish from the written narrative. Entire chapters of suffering were erased, softened, or replaced with phrases like, "the captives were taken," or "order was restored," disguising the terror that lay behind those words. This deliberate omission did not happen by accident. It was a strategy as calculated as the military campaigns themselves. Ancient rulers understood the importance of image. They wanted later generations to admire their wisdom, discipline, and supposed sense of justice. Brutality against women threatened that image. If the public or future historians saw how deeply rooted these acts were in imperial policy, the legacy of noble conquest would crumble. So scribes were instructed to highlight the glory of the army, the triumph of the ruler, the expansion of borders, and the prosperity that supposedly followed. The shock, humiliation, and violence endured by women were pushed out of sight, leaving a historical record that hides more than it reveals. Yet fragments of truth slip through the cracks. Letters from soldiers to their families, personal diaries of lesser officials, and archaeological discoveries show details the official chronicles avoided. These fragments give voice to women whose stories were intentionally buried. Some accounts describe villages where not a single woman was left untouched. Others speak of forced relocations where women were separated from their families, marched for miles, and assigned to roles designed to erase their identity entirely. These are not exaggerated tales. They are the missing pieces of a history recorded by those who had the most to gain from concealing the truth. And while chroniclers hid these realities, communities who lived through the terror preserved the memory in a different way. Folktales, songs whispered at night, and local traditions carried the suffering forward, ensuring it would not be forgotten even when the empire tried to silence it. In some regions, the trauma became so deeply woven into the cultural fabric that future generations continued to live under the shadow of violence they never personally witnessed. The pain traveled through time, just as effectively as any official inscription, shaping identity long after the conquerors had vanished. When we compare the official accounts with the silent evidence uncovered later, the contrast is striking. One speaks of order, victory, and honor. The other exposes manipulation, censorship, and cruelty. Between these conflicting narratives lies the real story, one that requires careful listening to the voices that survived outside the pages of empire-approved history. And as we examine these silences, we begin to uncover the immense weight carried by women whose suffering was intentionally hidden from the world, revealing how the erasure itself became another layer of violence. If any part of this resonates with you or reminds you of how history often protects the powerful, leave a comment sharing your thoughts or impressions. Your perspective helps bring attention to the voices that were suppressed for centuries, continuing the work that the empires tried so hard to silence. As we Follow the hidden traces left outside official chronicles. Another truth emerges from the depths of antiquity. The capture of women did not end on the battlefield or in the chaos of a conquered city. For many, the real ordeal began after the smoke cleared, when they were absorbed into vast networks of human commerce that stretched across ancient empires. These routes, often celebrated in history for spreading culture, wealth, and innovation, also carried an invisible and far more sinister cargo. Women taken in war were moved like commodities, assigned a market value, and placed into systems that thrived on the erasure of their past lives. Empires used these networks to reshape populations, redistribute labor, and strengthen political alliances. Women were transported across deserts, mountains, and seas, sometimes covering distances greater than the armies that captured them. The journey itself was grueling. Marches under burning sun, nights without shelter, and constant surveillance prevented escape and reinforced the message that they were now property of the empire. Many captives never returned to their homeland, not because they died on the battlefield, but because they were swallowed by a machinery that dispersed them to distant provinces where their identities dissolved into anonymity. Markets existed in every major capital where officials, merchants, and military leaders exchanged captives as part of economic and political transactions. Some women were kept in palaces, forced into domestic servitude, or exploited for entertainment. Others were sent to agricultural estates, textile workshops, or coastal ports where their labor enriched the empire further. Their lives became bound to the prosperity of rulers who never acknowledged the human cost behind their achievements. Archaeological records reveal signs of this forced movement, from foreign garments found in unexpected regions to burial sites where women were interred far from their cultural homeland, indicating the depth of their displacement. In some cases, the fate of these women became entangled with diplomacy. Conquered women were given as gifts to solidify alliances, sent to foreign courts as tokens of submission, or used to secure loyalty from local chieftains. Through their bodies, political agreements were forged and territories stabilized. Yet, unlike the treaties written in stone or clay tablets, their stories remained unwritten, carried only by the memories of those who witnessed their departure. What makes this system even more haunting is how efficient it became. Over time, empires refined these trade routes, integrating them into the economic backbone of their territories. The commerce of captured women supported industries, funded military campaigns, and reinforced the social hierarchy that placed conquerors at the top and the conquered at the very bottom. Every city enriched by trade, every marketplace that thrived on imperial commerce, carried within it the invisible imprint of lives uprooted and repurposed for imperial ambition. As we continue peeling back the layers of what was carefully hidden, the picture becomes unmistakable. The suffering of captured women was not an accidental byproduct of conquest. It was woven into the very infrastructure that allowed empires to grow, survive, and dominate the ancient world. And the deeper we look, the more clearly we see how these systems shaped not only the fate of individuals, but the future of entire civilizations, leaving shadows that stretch across history into the next part of this story. As we follow these buried roots of displacement, another layer of imperial control becomes visible, one even more unsettling in its intent. For many captured women, their fate was not limited to labor, relocation, or silent suffering. They were transformed into instruments of propaganda, punishment, and social engineering, molded into symbols that empires used to reinforce their authority both inside and beyond their borders. The body of a woman became a message, one crafted with chilling precision, projected not only to enemies but to allies, subjects, and even the empire's own soldiers. Commanders understood that the treatment of captured women could shape perception more effectively than any speech delivered in a royal court. Some women were forced into public appearances meant to display the supposed benevolence of the empire. They were dressed in foreign garments and paraded, through markets or ceremonies to demonstrate the reach of imperial power. Others were showcased in triumphal processions, where generals celebrated victory while their captives walked behind them, stripped of identity, serving as living proof of conquest. These spectacles were not meant to honor them. They were crafted to condition populations into accepting the empire's dominance as inevitable and unshakable. But propaganda took darker forms as well. In certain regions, women were used as warnings. Their suffering was displayed at city gates or along roads leading to rebellious provinces, transforming them into silent threats meant to dissuade any thought of uprising. The message was cruelly simple. If resistance continued, the same fate awaited every family. These acts were not hidden. They were staged with intention, ensuring that news traveled quickly across communities. Fear became a currency empires spent generously, knowing that once planted, it spread without effort. Within military ranks, the presence of captured women served another purpose. They became tools to reinforce hierarchy and loyalty. Officers received captives as rewards, tangible proof of their status. For lower-ranking soldiers, witnessing these rewards reinforced the idea that imperial violence was normal, justified, even honorable. Over time, this conditioning shaped the psychology of entire armies. Soldiers learned to interpret female suffering as part of their duty, a necessary ritual that accompanied victory. This moral distortion did not happen overnight. It was cultivated through repeated exposure, integrated into the rhythm of military life until even the most disturbing acts seemed ordinary. In political circles, captured women became bargaining chips. Their forced marriages to local leaders helped secure alliances. Their placement in influential households created networks of surveillance and control. Their children, born into mixed origins, were sometimes used to integrate conquered populations more smoothly into the empire. The manipulation of identity, lineage, and kinship was not incidental. It was deliberate, part of a broader strategy that exploited women not only as individuals, but as conduits for reshaping entire social structures. Even in death, some women became symbols. Artistic depictions showed defeated figures kneeling before emperors, reinforcing the narrative of submission. These images, replicated in carvings, pottery, and murals, circulated through the empire like a visual language. They taught generations who held power and who did not. They reinforced a worldview in which the suffering of women was inseparable from the triumph of empire. And yet, behind every symbol was a person. A life erased, repurposed, or rewritten by forces too powerful to resist. As these practices spread across empires and centuries, the transformation of women into instruments of authority became one of the most persistent and least acknowledged pillars of ancient domination. And the deeper we trace this pattern, the more clearly we see the heavy silence surrounding those who witnessed horrors they were never allowed to speak about, leading directly into the next part of this hidden history. The deeper we explore these layers of erased suffering, the more the spotlight turns toward those who witnessed everything yet were forbidden to speak. Among the ranks of imperial soldiers, silence became a second uniform, worn as tightly as their armor. Many of these men marched into conquered cities believing they understood the brutality of war, only to face scenes that shattered whatever sense of honor their commanders had tried to instill. They saw women dragged from their homes, separated from families, forced into servitude, or displayed as instruments of fear. And while some participated willingly, others found themselves trapped in a system where obedience mattered more than morality. For young recruits, these first encounters with the empire's hidden practices were often moments of profound shock. They had been raised on stories of glorious campaigns and noble victories, yet what they witnessed behind the front lines was a stark contrast to the mythology. Some tried to look away, others numbed themselves to survive, and a few attempted to intervene only to be threatened, punished, or reassigned. The message from their superiors was clear. What happened to captured women was not to be questioned. It was simply another mechanism of imperial control, no different from building a road or collecting taxes. As soldiers moved from region to region, they carried these memories like invisible scars. Letters sent home hinted at indescribable scenes without daring to describe them. Personal notes discovered centuries later in isolated ruins or military outposts reveal glimpses of internal conflict. Some wrote of sleepless nights haunted by the cries they could not forget. Others described the pressure to conform, to treat cruelty as routine, to silence any trace of compassion. Over time, this emotional burden fractured many who served. The empire demanded unwavering loyalty, and that loyalty required the suppression of conscience. For career soldiers, silence became a survival tactic. Speaking openly risked accusations of weakness or disobedience. Commanders who enforced these practices understood that dissent could spread like wildfire, threatening discipline. To prevent this, they imposed strict rules forbidding discussion of what took place in makeshift camps, holding cells, or during forced relocations. Recruits quickly learned that protecting the empire's reputation meant burying the truth, even from themselves. What makes this enforced silence even more tragic is the way it rippled through generations. Veterans returned home carrying memories they could not share, unable to explain the shadows in their eyes or the sudden anger that erupted without warning. Their communities saw only the outward signs of battle, unaware of the moral wounds inflicted by what they had been commanded to witness. And in this way, the suffering of captured women extended far beyond the moment of conquest. It reshaped the men who observed it, and through them, reshaped families, villages, and entire cultures long after the empire itself had fallen. Some soldiers did attempt to record what they saw, scratching notes onto fragments of pottery or hiding written accounts inside walls, hoping someone in the distant future would uncover the truth they were forbidden to speak. These rare testimonies, discovered centuries later, stand as some of the only unfiltered windows into the cruelty that official documents avoided. They reveal the depth of the emotional battle fought inside the men who served, trapped between duty and conscience, haunted by suffering they could neither prevent nor acknowledge. If anything in this resonates with you, or if it reminds you of how silence often protects the powerful while burying the truth of those who suffered, share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice helps give weight to stories that were never allowed to be told. As we move deeper into the hidden mechanisms of imperial domination, one reality becomes impossible to ignore. The suffering of captured women was not only a consequence of war, it became one of the most effective weapons ever used by ancient empires. Sexual violence, often treated by later historians as an unfortunate byproduct of conflict, was in many regions a deliberate strategy crafted to destabilize entire populations. By violating women, empires violated the identity of a people. They shattered the emotional, cultural, and spiritual foundations that held communities together, ensuring that resistance would weaken long before the next campaign began. The use of sexual violence as a tool of terror was systematic. Commanders understood that harming women inflicted a type of psychological devastation that no army could recover from quickly. Families grieved in silence, ashamed and unable to speak openly about what had happened. Leaders who might have organized resistance instead found themselves navigating a landscape of shattered honor and broken social ties. This emotional collapse served the empire far more efficiently than any physical destruction of walls or weapons. The conquerors knew it, and they used it with precision. In many regions, reports from surviving Gao, inscriptions and foreign observers suggest that the threat of sexual violence alone was enough to force entire towns to surrender without a single battle. People knew what happened when armies breached city walls. They had heard stories carried along rivers, trade routes, and caravan paths. Stories of women taken in the night, children forced to witness scenes they could not comprehend, and families who lost everything in a moment. These horrors spread like an invisible smoke long before an army arrived, softening resistance and making conquest quicker, cheaper, and far more efficient. Even within the ranks of the empire, the weaponization of women's suffering served political interests. Sexual violence reinforced hierarchies, allowing officers to assert dominance over soldiers, and soldiers over captives. By permitting or encouraging these acts, rulers blurred the lines between structured warfare and unrestrained brutality, creating an atmosphere where cruelty became a shared language of power. Some empires even rewarded soldiers with the right to take women after victory, embedding violence directly into their military identity. The result was a cycle in which brutality reinforced loyalty, and loyalty demanded further brutality. This practice also left long-term scars on conquered populations. Entire genealogies became tangled with forced unions, creating identity crises that lasted for centuries. In some regions, children born from these acts were marginalized or used strategically to manipulate demographic balance. Empires understood the generational consequences of sexual violence and, in some cases, exploited it intentionally to reshape conquered societies from within. Cultural traditions shifted, family structures fractured, and entire communities carried invisible wounds passed from parent to child. Yet the most disturbing aspect is how completely these acts vanished from official memory. Chroniclers described conquests with elaborate detail but avoided the realities that women faced. They wrote of triumphs, integration, and peace, as if these achievements came without cost. This silence served the empire, preserving a heroic image while burying the truth beneath layers of political propaganda. And because victims had no voice, history absorbed the version written by those who held the quills and the power. Still, every fragment that survives, from private letters to foreign accounts, reveals that sexual violence was not a byproduct of war, but one of the empire's most devastating strategies. It reshaped populations, broke social resilience, and ensured that even after resistance died, its echoes remained in the lives of women who were never meant to be remembered. And through these echoes, the next chapter of this hidden history emerges, revealing how empires competed not only in military strength, but in the cruelty they inflicted upon the women who fell into their hands. The deeper we look into the fabric of ancient conquest, the more evident it becomes that cruelty toward captured women was not merely tolerated, but weaponized in a disturbing competition among empires. Far from being isolated incidents, these acts became markers of dominance, symbols of how far a civilization was willing to go to establish fear and authority. As empires expanded, they not only sought to outmatch each other in military strategy, architecture, and diplomacy, but in the severity of punishment inflicted on those who resisted them. Women, caught at the crossroads of political ambition and cultural annihilation, became the most vulnerable targets in this escalating cycle of brutality. Historical records, foreign descriptions, and archaeological remains suggest that rival empires observed one another closely. When one dynasty displayed extreme harshness toward its captives, others followed, amplifying the cruelty as if it were part of an unspoken competition. Assyrians carved scenes showing lines of women led away from burning cities, their bodies portrayed with deliberate vulnerability. Later, neighboring cultures created their own versions of these displays, using women to signal their strength to allies and enemies alike. The message was unmistakable. An empire that could dominate its women prisoners so completely would not hesitate to crush any opposing force. In regions where borders frequently shifted, the fate of captured women often served as a direct reflection of political tensions. During periods of instability, the treatment of women became even more severe, as rulers attempted to project resilience through public demonstrations of control. Some empires forced women to participate in ceremonies meant to celebrate victory, while others used them in state rituals that blurred the line between punishment and propaganda. The cruelty was not only physical, it was psychological, designed to humiliate entire populations by displaying their women as symbols of defeat. This competitive cruelty also manifested in the transport and redistribution of captives. While some empires used women primarily for labor or exploitation within their own territories, others sent them to distant provinces as a form of political messaging. A conquered city might see its women marched hundreds of miles away, their presence in foreign lands serving as a living reminder of the empire's reach. These forced migrations destabilized communities, destroyed family structures, and ensured that memories of resistance were forever overshadowed by the trauma of displacement. In the imperial courts, the suffering of these women became a silent currency in diplomatic negotiations. When emissaries arrived from rival states, rulers sometimes displayed their captives to convey strength without uttering a single word. The sight of foreign women, stripped of their dignity and identity, sent a clear signal about the consequences of challenging imperial authority. These scenes were designed to linger in the minds of visiting leaders, influencing their decisions long after they had returned home. What makes this race toward cruelty even more disturbing is the way it shaped the internal identity of each empire. Soldiers who participated in these acts carried them into future campaigns, desensitized and conditioned to escalate violence further. Commanders expected their troops not only to win battles, but to uphold the empire's reputation for severity. Conquest became more than occupation. It became a performance of unforgiving domination, and the bodies of captured women were placed at the center of that performance. Over centuries, this competition created a pattern that stretched across continents. Whether in the Mediterranean, the Near East, or the early kingdoms of Central Asia, the treatment of captured women revealed the harshness of the empire that ruled them. And although each civilization crafted its own version of conquest, their cruelty aligned in one chilling truth. The suffering of women became the battlefield where empires measured their ruthlessness, crafting legacies built not only on military victories, but on the silent agony of those whose stories were never meant to be told. As these patterns of cruelty unfold across centuries, another truth begins to rise from the shadows left by empires long gone. The suffering of captured women did not disappear with the collapse of the states that oppressed them. Instead, it seeped into the cultural memory of entire regions, shaping traditions, fears, and social structures that persisted long after the last stone of a fortress had crumbled. Families carried this inherited trauma quietly, passing down fragments of stories told in whispers, shaping the way communities viewed safety, honor, and vulnerability. These memories endured in rituals, folk tales, and even in unspoken rules about marriage, family roles, and the protection of daughters, revealing how deeply ancient violence carved itself into the emotional landscape of countless societies. In many places, the scars became so deeply rooted that future generations grew up reacting to an event they never witnessed. Communities built customs around safeguarding women, not only from external threats, but from the echoes of past devastations that had reshaped their identity. Songs that mourned unnamed women, poems that spoke of distant sorrow, and superstitions tied to the fear of outsiders all hint at a world still haunted by the cruelty imposed centuries before. These cultural responses were a way to make sense of pain that had no proper record, because the truth had been erased from the official narrative, but not from the collective heart. The silence imposed by empires lingered long after their armies vanished. Historians piecing together these fragments often found themselves navigating a labyrinth of gaps, contradictions, and edited accounts. Every missing line in a chronicle, every softened description of conquest, and every sanitized inscription served as evidence of a much larger truth beneath the surface. The brutality inflicted on women was so integral to imperial domination that removing it from the record created distortions still felt today. And yet, despite the silence, traces remain everywhere. In archaeological discoveries showing displaced female remains, in letters describing horrors the empire tried to hide, in artistic depictions that inadvertently reveal suffering behind triumph, and in the quiet symbols embedded in cultural heritage. These shadows also remind us of resilience. For every attempt to erase their suffering, women found ways to survive, adapt, and carry forward the fragments of identity that empires tried to destroy. Their endurance, though rarely documented, shaped the continuity of their peoples more profoundly than any victory claimed by a conqueror. Understanding this history does not only expose what happened, it restores dignity to those who were silenced, allowing their presence to return to the story that was built deliberately without them. As we reach this point, you might feel the weight of these forgotten histories, or perhaps a sense that the past still reverberates in ways we rarely acknowledge. If this message stayed with you until now, leave a comment with the phrase, "This message was for me," so I know you walked through every layer of this story. And if the content in this video helped you see ancient history with clearer eyes, consider subscribing to the channel so you do not miss the next deep exploration we bring to light. Your support helps keep these hidden stories alive. And if you feel connected to what we uncovered together, a like on this video helps this conversation reach more people who never imagined what lay behind the official version of the past. There is another video here on the side that expands these themes even further. Click and continue with me there as we uncover the next chapter of what history tried to hide.